Hey everyone. The topic of this discussion is cyber in global conflict. And I interpret that as conflicts between governments. And I think it's a fascinating topic. I think it's one of the most important things that everybody who works in the field of cyber has to think about. So I'll kick it off by introducing myself. My name is Joe Sullivan. I've been in and around cybersecurity since the 1990s in a number of different roles. I'm currently in a nonprofit role helping do humanitarian aid to Ukraine. And I got involved because of the cyber aspects of that conflict. And what I'm seeing unfold in that world is very similar to what I've seen unfold over the last 20 years, and I'm sure you've both seen unfold over the last 20 years as well. So why don't you introduce yourselves and maybe give a brief word about what you've seen in terms of living on the front lines of global conflict where cyber is part of it.
Sure. So my name is Michael Danil. I am currently the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. We're a nonprofit information sharing organization. Prior to that, I served for 4.5 years as President Obama's cybersecurity advisor and the National Cybersecurity Coordinator. And then prior to that, I had a long career at the Office of Management and Budget in the national security area. And I would say that there's actually two aspects to cyber and global conflict. There is conflict that is carried out through cyberspace and in cyberspace, right? Where the terrain, if you will, of the conflict is digital. And then there's the use of cyber capabilities to have an effect in the real world. And so when I think about it, it's both aspects. I think what we've seen over the last couple of decades is that many countries have discovered that carrying out, trying to pursue their national security, their foreign policy through cyberspace and through cyber means is actually a very effective methodology. It's relatively cheap compared to a lot of other capabilities to build. It is got some characteristics that make it a little bit deniable, so you can have a little bit of the plausible deniability. And it tends to also be asymmetric. The countries like the United States and other developed nations are more vulnerable than a lot of the adversary nations. And so this has made it a very attractive tool for a lot of countries. And I'll just finish this part by saying that when I first got into cybersecurity in the mid-2000s, we were probably tracking about 4 or 5 offensive programs around the world. By the time I left in 2017, we were up over 40. And I'm sure that number is probably double that now.
At least.
Good afternoon, Danil, Kerimi. I wear many hats, but here I come as a dear friend of Val, who has put this whole organization together. And I worked with quite a few, including with Michael, on setting up a few programs that now led to the creation of the World Economic Forum Center for the cybersecurity. We're here in Davos, and one interesting fact that you may or may not know, probably the Swiss among you will know it, is that the security of Davos is provided by the federal Swiss government. So all the helicopters, all the fighter jets that you hear are flying, and all the army personnel that you don't see, you see police, but there's army personnel that you don't see up in the mountains, is all provided by the Swiss government. And Swiss army loves the World Economic Forum. And the reason why they love the World Economic Forum is because this is the only week in the whole year where all the forces have to work together. It's basically like an annual exercise. They get all the fuel they need for their jets, they get all the ammunition they need for their everything that they need. And if you're here still on Saturday, you'll witness a very interesting scene where all these soldiers will be coming down from the mountains and meeting their girlfriends in the local pubs. So there will be scenes like from the Kiss, like Times Square, iconic scenes. I love Saturday here because it's just really fantastic feeling. But you know who doesn't really love the World Economic Forum? Is a Swiss cyber force. Because I don't need this week to exercise. They are on all the time. And this week is a hell of a week for them. And that's perhaps the biggest difference between the traditional and the new capability that cyber brought into the geopolitical competition among member states. I will stop here, but I'm also very interested in the conversation around not only the conflict, but also humanitarian aspect of this.
I think the three of us represent, at different points in our careers, all the different groups that need to come together in the way that you describe. I've reflected a lot lately on how cyber has changed the dynamic between people and their governments. And what I mean is, like, if we go back in time, why did people create governments in the first place? I would suggest it was probably for the collective safety of the group. And for, tens of thousands of years, that group could protect itself with physical weapons. And if something broke the perimeter and came in, you could hold the government accountable, and it was all tied to that one government that you trusted and you had empowered as citizens of it. And then the internet came along, and it allowed other governments and non-governments, for all different types of motivations, to cross those borders in ways that we never saw before. And then layer on top of it, what percentage of the internet is in private hands forces a level of collaboration between government and other organizations that you've never had to do before. I mean, for you, in the United States government, I think during the time when we really started to understand the power of that, how did you think about bringing together such disparate groups?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you very quickly realize is that unlike many other areas, like what you were saying, so in counterterrorism, for example, that's a government game, right? The private sector has an interest in this, and they have interest in physical security, but that's primarily a government game, right? And cyber is completely different because you actually need that kind of collaboration between the public and the private sector in order to have the effect that you want to have. And what I realized when I was in government was that we didn't even have the language to describe what we were talking about. Because from the government's perspective, most of the time they interacted with the private sector as either a purchaser, like they were buying goods and services from the private sector, or they were a regulator, right? They were an enforcer. And so we talk about these public-private partnerships, but what the hell does that mean? The language is very squishy. And so I think one of the places where we're still evolving is trying to figure out what do we actually mean? What do we want the private sector to do, not do? What do we want governments to do and not do? Where is the comparative advantage between the government and the private sector? And I would also say between the government and the nonprofit sector and the private sector. And so from that aspect, Joe, I think we were just at the beginning of really thinking through these policy issues that I think have continued to evolve. And where my thinking is today is this idea of what I call operational collaboration, where you want to synchronize activities in time to have an intended effect. But there's a lot of policy challenges with making that happen in a way that actually protects everyone's interests.
What do the two of you say to the security executive who would point out something like, well, if a cartel crossed a national border and ransacked a department store, and everybody who was in the department store just took all of their belongings and then went back across the border, would you you wouldn't hold the department store security guard responsible for not stopping a massive attack of that nature. But a security executive is somehow supposed to be able to stop a nation-state cyber attack. How do we get to a place where that security leader feels comfortable with the government answer on that?
Sure. I mean, you have a direct government experience. My experience is more in the international public sector, where I think that's perhaps is the key, because Michael mentioned counterterrorism. My career with the international public sector started after 9/11, where I was working for the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, promoting and enhancing international cooperation in legal cooperation, extraditions, things like that on counterterrorism. And one interesting fact for me is the reason why I joined that particular branch was that even in the height of the Cold War, where parties could not agree to many things, the international community managed to pass 12 international instruments, treaties and protocols outlining certain acts of international terrorism. So they managed to agree that regardless of your motivations, hijacking a plane is a bad thing. And they managed to maintain international cooperation and enforce those rules, and they came in very handy after 9/11. So that's one. Two, to answer your question, I think there's now more and more sophisticated understanding among the private sector and the public sector. It started, as Michael said, how do you this is such a new domain. You didn't have the language. You didn't know what the responsibility. Are you supervisor? Are you buying my services? What is your role of government vis-a-vis private sector in the cyberspace? But now, I think there's much more sophisticated understanding. And later this year, I think this will be once again codified, hopefully, in the International Cybercrime Treaty. Now, there's this very political contentious discussion, but I think now everybody realizes to avoid those misunderstandings, who is responsible, how to react, what are the national responsibilities in protecting their own citizens. I think there has to be an international instrument that would codify that, and hopefully states will be able to agree to pass that in September. There's still a lot of work to be done, certainly, because it's a very politically motivated.
Yeah, and I think, and I actually heard the term earlier today that I think is one of the problems in this space, which is standard of care. Like, in the physical realm, like, while we wouldn't expect the department store to be capable of stopping the international drug cartel, we would expect them to be able to, like, prosecute shoplifters or to, stop shoplifters, right? And part of our problem in cybersecurity is we really haven't defined what we expect companies to be able to do. What level of cybersecurity should we expect out of a private sector company? And I would say clearly what we should expect out of Flo's flower shop is going to be very different than what we expect out of Verizon, which is going to be different again than what we expect out of the US government. And I think that's part of the conversation that we need to really get to, which is actually defining what we expect out of our different organizations at different levels, different sizes. And we really haven't gotten down to that yet. And I think that's how we'll actually make some of the progress against that problem.
Well, I live in Northern California near San Francisco, and I think the stores are leaving because they're not getting the help with stopping the shoplifters. So the physical world still has its problems too. Well, I don't know if either of you noticed, but we're operating this conference right next door to the World Economic Forum conference, and they put out a statement, I think, yesterday and said the #1 global risk for 2024 is misinformation and disinformation. I'm not sure what the difference is between those two words. I should have looked it up before this session. But I have a general understanding of the risk, having been the chief security officer at Facebook in the past. And that is something that we're thinking about a lot right now because we believe that governments are getting involved in misinformation and disinformation in a very aggressive way. It's a topic that I think a lot about because I remember when I started at Facebook in 2008 and left in 2015, and we built out a big security organization and we thought about a lot of risks, but misinformation and disinformation back then was not something that anybody was talking about really until the 2016 election in the United States. And now we're all talking about it, and I was at a Ukraine-related event last night where everyone was speaking about a lot of the Ukrainians who were here all of a sudden found on certain social media platforms that they were getting a bunch of propaganda that they had never seen before because they were in a different place. And how do we even start to tackle what has been deemed the largest risk to the world?
You want me to jump on that one first?
Please.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is an incredibly difficult topic, right, for for anyone to deal with because we, particularly for the United States, right, where we have resolutely made a dividing line between cybersecurity, the security of the information, versus the information itself, the information content. And this makes it particularly challenging for us because we've actually divided those into two different disciplines. And in many countries, they actually don't think of it that way. You know, in fact, like the Russian term that they prefer to use is informatsiya bezopasnosti, you know, information security. They don't even think about dividing it the way that we do. And I forget the Mandarin term for it, but it's a similar concept in Mandarin. So I think one of the challenges for us is we have to start thinking about how do we create trusted institutions and how do you have trusted reference points that you can use to baseline information. And how do we start to teach and train and educate our populace to be able to wade through that? And I think it's actually possible to do, by the way. I don't think it's actually completely impossible. If you go back and you look at advertising from the late 19th century, we find it actually kind of amusing because we're like, really, did that work? How did they ever actually sell anything with that? And it's because people were much less sophisticated about how they consumed advertising. And I think we have to just get much more sophisticated about how we consume information. And some of that is just the change, some of that is actually true just because, like, I think about the difference between when I was in school versus my kids now. Like, when I was in school, it was still hard to find information. Like, you actually had to make a physical effort. You had to go to a library, probably even use a card catalog, like, you know, go to the stacks, actually find the book. Like, it was work. You actually had to work at finding information. And now, that's not the problem. The problem is actually sorting through the information and determining what is useful, what is not. And those are skills that we're going to have to develop. And I think the issue is, can we manage the misinformation and disinformation until we as societies have actually built the capability to do that more organically?
I'm curious, with your perspective, having worked here and helped with this conference next door, thinking about cybersecurity, it's fascinating to me that that was chosen as the topic, you know, the #1 risk. What do you think is the goal in putting it out there like that right now?
Well, and in the full disclosure, I had nothing to do in the past 2 or 3 years in agenda setting here, but I think it's just the way that risk report is being combined is through the number of surveys, also through the partners. A number of insurance and reinsurances are based there. So it's a lot of listening to the partners, a lot of collective wisdom that goes there. I would actually add also to your misinformation and disinformation a couple more terms completely confuse you: malinformation and no information. Mm-hmm. And
what was the last one?
No information.
No information.
In many parts of the world, we shouldn't forget there's like zero information, and that's still a big issue, right? And unlike and by the way, I did exactly the same. You go to a library and you look for a source, but unlike in different parts of the world, those parts that still have no information don't even have a library to go to. So. But I completely agree with Michael, is that I think people like to complain about this topic without necessarily realizing that they as individuals have a big responsibility. Somebody fools you in your private life, tells you lies. Whose fault it is? Is it your fault that you believe that person? Now, this is just more sophisticated, algorithmic driven, and, you know, with a big budgets behind it, basically operations. But at the same time, some countries have sophisticated populations that have learned how to distinguish, and some other countries are still learning.
Yeah, I see that. I see a couple of really big problems. One is the fundamental disagreement on what is truth, and especially as we experience more polarization, which I think was the #3 greatest risk in the world, according to this year's report. And so part one is we can't even agree, if we look at a piece of content, whether it is truth or misinformation. But the second challenge, I think, is that this is something that governments are trying to grapple with, but governments don't have access to most of the content that they're concerned about because of my earlier point about that content being on the servers of private companies and the privacy settings not making it totally public.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right that the challenges that we face in this area are, they are multiplying, and I do think that, trying to find those baselines, those anchors of trust and truth are going to be very difficult. But I do think that we have to, strive to separate out where you have policy differences, where you have political differences, where you have differing views and values, because we were also having a values discussion earlier this morning, and that's fine, but there are certain pieces that I think we really do have to strive towards saying, no, there are some objective baselines here that you can try to reject them, but it's kind of like trying to reject gravity, right? You can declare that it doesn't exist all you want, but you're still not going to be able to overcome it. And so I think that's where you have to, start building up from. But I also think that it's important in this space to, when you have some of those conversations, to understand what is driving that desire for a different way of looking at the world, and what are the underlying reasons for that. Because as is often the case, I come back to people may not always do what economists think of as sophisticated rational analysis, but they are also not stupid, and they are pursuing their interest as best they understand them. And so I think that's critical to understanding and thinking about this area.
Yeah, who should be responsible for stopping misinformation and disinformation?
Ministry of Truth, of course.
Would that we were in that world.
Yes. I mean, yes, there was, yeah. I think of the old Russian saying about, there's no, there were two major newspapers in the Soviet Union, Pravda and Izvestia, so the truth and the news, and the saying was there's no truth in the news and no news in the truth, right? So I think, it is very difficult to, and I don't know that we can actually assign that responsibility to any one entity in every situation. I think that they're going to be different, you're going to assign that responsibility to different entities, different organizations in different situations. So for example, I am going to argue that in the case of weather forecasting, I'm going to take the National Oceanographic, NOAA in the United States as the ground truth, because that's a good source. And in other places, I may want to choose another source.
Okay, I'm gonna. We have one more seat at the end of the row here, and I'm gonna invite one more guest up to the stage. This is the hot seat.
We've already solved all the problems, so it's good for you.
I kind of counted on you for doing that.
Yes.
Profound apologies for being late. I didn't anticipate the cable car.
Yeah, so well, we each took a moment to introduce ourselves, and the topic for our conversation being cyber layered on top of global conflict. And so we welcome you to join this conversation because it's a difficult conversation. So why don't you take a minute to kind of introduce yourself to the audience here and online.
Well, this is the most beautiful location for a panel that I've done in Davos, with fantastic views. Well, so my name is Andre Pienaar. I'm the chief executive from C5 Capital, which is a national security-oriented investment firm based in Washington, D.C. and London. And one of the areas in which we invest in is cybersecurity. And what we have seen across our cybersecurity investment portfolio is that number one, there's an escalation in cyber attacks, particularly from nation-state adversaries worldwide. We had the first indications of that during COVID, when there was an almost 3,000% increase of cyber attacks on healthcare infrastructure worldwide, a great deal of that emanating out of Russia. And since the end of COVID, that pattern has continued. And so today, when you think about when an enterprise or an institution, a not-for-profit organization, or a government think about their cybersecurity, it's not just the threat from cyber criminals or from hacktivists. It's also a very serious threat from nation-state adversaries, which in many cases have vast and almost unlimited resources if they decide to target you. And in addition, we see an overlap often between cyber criminals, cyber organized crime, and state-sponsored cyber attacks. Russia, again, is the best example of this. Russia today earns in the range of $8.5 to $10 billion from cyber attacks on Western companies. Now, if you compare that, for example, to the proceeds of the total rough diamond trade, which is in the range of $8 billion, it's almost an industry bigger than the diamond industry worldwide. So cybersecurity is of critical importance going forward, and this is a really important subject and discussion.
I'm going to stay with you for a minute or two because we moved the hot seat over to you. One of the things that we've been grappling with here on the stage is the World Economic Forum just put out a statement that the #1 global risk is misinformation and disinformation. And one of the hardest questions is who's responsible for stopping it. And in many areas of cybersecurity, it has been private investment that's funded the cybersecurity companies that we all rely on to help defend enterprises and governments. Do you see any kind of investment in startups that are fighting misinformation and disinformation? And I guess a second related question is, who's buying that product if they're building it?
There's a very important overlap and growing overlap between cybersecurity and misinformation and disinformation. And often the same players who are responsible for cyber attacks are the perpetrators of disinformation and misinformation. Generative artificial intelligence, of course, have created new tools that enables both disinformation and misinformation, but also potentially enables better and automated verification. So this whole challenge of disinformation and misinformation has become a segment in the cybersecurity market. It's a new segment. We hosted a conference on it for the first time last year, bringing together not only cybersecurity companies, but also folks from the media and the journalistic community, folks from who are involved in election integrity and business, and of course government. If cybersecurity is a market that is about $190 billion market, I think this segment of the market is going to grow in importance, and it really touches on everything. It touches on the integrity of information. It touches on the integrity of identity, which is a foundational concept for cybersecurity. It touches on the integrity of our democracies and elections. It touches on reputation. It touches on how we make decisions and whether we have the right information to make decisions, particularly in a crisis situation. So I think this is going to be a very significant and important growth area for the future. All enterprise customers, all CISOs, all boards should factor disinformation and misinformation into their cybersecurity planning, their cybersecurity governance, and their cybersecurity spending. It's essential that chief executives and the board of companies get to grips with this as a new evolution in the cybersecurity threat market, because it can impact on their business and the future and the value of their business in so many ways.
Yeah, I don't know, like going back to your time in government, how would you think about trying to get private enterprises to start caring about doing something about misinformation and disinformation in particular?
Well, I think you have to look at it from how does it tie into their main business operations, right? And we talk a lot about this in cybersecurity that, if you try to treat it as purely a technical issue that's off over here somewhere, that's run by Joe, who we don't ever actually want to talk to. We just keep him in a closet someplace, right? That's not going to work. You have to tie it to the business of of whatever the organization is. And I think that's how we have to be thinking about it in the misinformation and disinformation space, right? That this is about how do you know, how could this misinformation and disinformation negatively affect your business line, right? And that ultimately, that businesses, legitimate businesses operating, have an interest in having that baseline of reliable information out there in order for them to actually conduct their business operations, whatever those operations are. And I think we have to do a much better job of making that explicit connection between the two. I mean, I will also note that in some ways, like, this is not a completely new problem. You know, there were, you know, governments have been trying to do propaganda, and people have been fighting back against propaganda probably since Hammurabi. I mean, like, this has been around for a long time, and I think that we shouldn't treat it as something utterly new, that we have to also look at how we have tried to tackle some of these questions in the past.
I agree with that idea that it's been around forever, but the fundamental challenge we face now is that the content is so much more like, everything's accessible to everybody, and most of the content is hosted by companies that don't have an economic interest in building huge teams to clean it up.
That's right. And so how do we actually start to think about, as governments, how do you incentivize those teams? How do you incentivize those companies to have an economic interest in that? And how do we actually think about changing some of the laws and policies to, you know, favor, you know, trying to seek that baseline, that anchor of trust and truth? And you're absolutely right that the scope and the scale is different. I'm just saying that I think that we shouldn't lose all hope, because you know, there is an ability. We have tackled some of these similar items before with different types of technologies, different types of processes, and people engagement, and we can do the same thing again here.
I guess I think we have to wrap up, so I want to just kind of pose one last question, and then we can finish up, and we'll go down the line. But what kind of incentives are there that we can create to really bring governments together to get better alignment with these companies? Because when we talk about global crisis and conflict, you know, obviously the war in Ukraine and what's happening in the Middle East right now have shown that governments are not aligned. Like, the biggest, most important governments in the world are very far from aligned with each other. And if you can't get alignment between the governments, then you're not going to get, you know, the example that we had earlier of everyone agreeing that, you know, terrorism in a particular way is bad. So is there hope for the future on this topic?
Well, organizations like the Cyber Future Foundation have a really important role to play as a convener and as a thought leader. I think we need more private sector initiative around this, and more open debate and discussion of the kind that we have this afternoon. But I also think that the crisis of the wars that we are facing will bring people together by necessity. We've already seen that where there have been established alliances in the West as a result of the Russian aggression in the Ukraine, as a result of Hamas's attack on Israel, that those relationships by and large have become stronger and have deepened by necessity. And I hope the same thing will happen in cybersecurity.
So there are examples in other areas where putting out false information is actually punishable by law. You cannot just put false financial data, right? And I think that's the examples that we increasingly need to start thinking and looking at. You know, so getting rid of Section 230, getting rid of many other things, and really treating where, you know, freedom of expression is extremely important and absolutely should be encouraged in any way possible. But you have to be distinguished between expressing an opinion and expressing facts. And we have to go after those informational Ponzi schemes.
Wow, you said a lot very softly there that we could do a whole nother session on next year.
Yeah. Well, and I think I think that's right, and I think that's what I mean by you have to start looking at the policies and regulations and the tools that we have. I actually will say that I think that there are some places where, there are a lot of places where it's going to be very, very difficult to bridge the divide, say, between the United States and Russia or the United States and China. But there are places where there is interest in, again, having some of those baselines. If you are the Chinese government and you want international investors, if you want to be able to sell internationally, you want that economic data to actually be reliable, or otherwise you can't achieve your other goals. And so there are places where there is alignment between the interests of the countries, and you have to look for those places to build there.
Awesome. Thank you all. It's the conversations like this that will get us forward. So thank you for hosting us and letting us be here.